Hello, everybody. It is Professor Parish, and we are almost to spring break. Can you believe it? So, what I want to do this week is go over, obviously, we have to finish up our poetry chapters and kind of talk about those. So, I'm going to do that. And then I want to go over what we're doing for this week and then give a little quick reminder about spring break. So before we dive into the remaining poetry chapters, I do want to go over what is happening in week 9 and what you can expect over spring break. So if I go to course content here and scroll down, I'm recording this on Sunday, so week 8's assignments are still due. I'm currently grading the reading responses. So far, so good. Week 9, we have 3 different items that will be due by March 10th, which is on Sunday. Our paper 2, the poetry paper, is due by Sunday night at 11:55 p.m. You can turn that in early if you get done. You will get a chance to revise this paper. I will go ahead and say that I do have plans over spring break, as you probably or may have too. So give me a little bit of time on grading paper 2. I'm going to try to get them done in a timely fashion, but I am about to tell you something about spring break that will delay my grading a little bit, so bear with me. Also, your poetry exam is up. This is exactly like the fiction exam, where it is not timed. You can open it up, you can save it, you can save your progress. I'll go ahead and click on it. The poetry exam, you do only get to take it one time, but as I've shown you with the fiction exam, there's different types of questions on this one. There's matching, multiple choice. There's only 10 questions. So there's no time limit, but it shouldn't take you too long to do this exam. You can always save your progress and come back to it if you're not finished. It is open book, so you can use your textbook. Everyone should get a good grade on this test. As long as you take your time, look up the answers, go through your notes, go through the lecture videos and the lecture presentations, you should be fine on this exam. Just be sure to note that once you turn it in, it is in. You cannot go back and redo it. So make sure you complete the entire exam before you submit it. So paper 2 is due in week 9. The poetry exam is due, and that's kind of our midterm. I don't have a midterm exam in this class because you're doing a poetry exam and you're turning in a paper. So that's 125 points. That's a pretty significant amount. And you have your discussion forum. So I think there's enough points here in week 9 to count towards your midterm. And so far, pretty much everybody in the class is doing great. So kudos to you all. You should all be feeling good as we go into spring break with English 122. The week 9 discussion forum, your posts are due Friday, responses are due by Sunday. And you can kind of, we'll just visit that real quick. There is this link to go to. It's called Poetry Out Loud. It's all spoken poetry, so you get to choose one of the poems listed to listen to and then answer the questions for. So it's kind of fun. I like this week's discussion forum because everybody tends to pick a different poem and for different reasons. So it's kind of cool to see what your choice was. And a lot of times students will see somebody talking about a poem and they'll be like, oh, I saw that poem. Let me go back and listen to it. Which is awesome, right? Poetry is so different spoken as it is just read. So I wanted to give you guys a good example of a site where you can actually hear some poetry read out loud. But getting back to course content, I want to talk about spring break really quick. As you'll note here, there are no assignments for spring break. Over spring break, I will be grading your assignments. I'm going to try to get those graded in a timely fashion, but please note that I, like yourself, probably have spring break plans, probably want to take a little mental break, so just give me some time on that. It feels like every semester I'll have students, or every year when we have spring break or Thanksgiving break, they'll be like, have you graded my paper yet? I'm like, it'll get done. Don't worry. Spring break though, our information technology, our IT unit, is scheduling an upgrade for my SIC and email. It won't impact any of you all. It's mainly for faculty and staff. However, in order for them to do this upgrade, and they have let all of the instructors at SIC know this, in order to do this upgrade, they have to shut SIC's, my SIC, and our Falcon Mail down temporarily. So they are planning on doing this upgrade from Monday, March 11th. They are hoping it is all finished by Wednesday, March 13th. So at least for March 11th, 12th, and 13th, we will not be able to get on my SIC or your Falcon Mail. I know, you're devastated. You're like, I can't check my grade or do online work. I get it. So just note that if you do try to get on, if you forget and try to get on, you're like, why can't I get on my SIC? It's because they're doing the upgrade. Now, they say that they'll be done by Wednesday night and that by March 14th, you should be able to get back on, but it's technology. Sometimes everything goes great. Sometimes they have some hiccups or glitches. So just please note that it may take them longer than Wednesday to get everything back online. Obviously, by the time we get back from spring break, everything will be fine. But during spring break, you may not be able to get online and see your grade, or I may not be able to get online and update your grade. So that's kind of my point when I say please give me some time to grade, because it may take me a little while. I won't be able to get on during the upgrade, so and I have plans towards the end of week for spring break, so just bear with me. Your grades will get updated online. It just may take me a little while. Okay? So that's pretty much it about spring break. There aren't any assignments. Take a mental break. I really like how we structure at SIC our spring break and our Thanksgiving break, because we all do. I know this is not the only class you all are taking probably. We do need like a mental break, just being like a... And spring break, I feel like we always time it very well at SIC because it's right at the midpoint. So it's right when you're halfway through the class, you're like, okay, I need a break for a week just to kind of gather my thoughts, breathe, and then we come back for the second half of the semester, and it seems like time just flies. So I'm excited to have a week off, and I know you all are too. And this will be a nice endpoint. We will finish up poetry this week, and then take a break, and then we'll start on drama and our research paper after that. So, exciting things. So that's pretty much it as far as assignments go. I will get your grammar checkup and reading responses done by tonight or tomorrow night, so you'll know at least your grades on those. And as always, feel free to turn things in early. I'm happy to grade your assignments early if I get them. Always. So, hopefully, if you have any questions about that, you can just let me know. All right, so now we're going to finish up talking about poetry. We had this presentation put up from last week when we talked about words and form and symbolism. So now we are going to carry on and finish up with chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22. And don't worry, they're pretty short chapters in terms of terminology. These are chapters with tons of examples. So be sure that if you need to go back and look at those example poems, because there's quite a few of them. Got to get my obligatory coffee sip before we start talking about persona. We've talked a little bit about persona in fiction and with nonfiction, and I'm going to go back to it here. In terms of prose, persona is the idea that you put on a front. You put on a mask to hide who you really are. And characters have personas. Maybe they seem like this calm and collected character, and then under the surface you find out that they're actually a hot mess. In persona, it's a little bit different with poetry. In poetry, persona is the voice that the author or the poet takes. So it's the voice speaking to you in the poem. It's kind of like, in poetry, persona is almost the narrator, or at least the narration that we get. So it's a little bit different than prose. The term takes on a little bit of a different meaning. But it's still the idea that it's a front, a character that the narrator becomes. There are different types of persona in poetry. Probably the most common is confessional. We've talked about confessional in prose where it's very diary-like. In terms of poetry, confessional is very personal. It's almost like someone's telling you a secret. Like the poet is revealing something to you. And on page 853, we have the example of Sappho. And Sappho is one of my favorite things about Greek mythology and rhetoric. If you're not familiar with Greek rhetoricians or mythology, Sappho is this poet that was in Greek times around the same time as Aristotle and Socrates. We hear Aristotle and Socrates, all these famous rhetoricians of Greek times and these teachers. Sappho actually was rumored to be one of Socrates' pupils and muses. And she's actually pretty much the only female poet in Greek times that's recognized as being an author. She wrote a lot of poetry. It was all very personal, very intimate, very sexual poetry. We read a lot in my rhetoric class about her. She just wrote some very personal things, and it's amazing that it was actually written down and shared publicly, some of the things that she shared. Because it's very sensual poetry. It's very raw. It's like kind of the stuff that you'd blush. If somebody wrote it now, you'd be like blushing reading it going, oh my. But yeah, the neat thing about Sappho is there are some people that think that she doesn't exist. Some people think that Sappho was a persona put on by Socrates, that she wasn't a pupil of Socrates, she was a fake name that Socrates used to write this poetry, which opens up a ton of questions if that's true. Because we talked about this in my rhetoric class in college. We're like, okay, well, if Socrates is putting on this female persona, why? Why did he feel he needed to publish poetry? Why this sensual poetry? Was it because he thought as a man he couldn't write it? You have to look back at Greek history. I personally think Sappho is a real person. I think she was maybe Socrates' muse and pupil, and because she was connected to him, that's how she got published, because she knew Socrates, and people were like, well, if you're best friends with Socrates, I guess you're good enough to get published. That's my opinion. Some people think that Sappho isn't real. I think she is. But anyway, you can see an example of her poem on page 853, and it's extremely personal, which is kind of neat that you don't think of poetry that old having this kind of intimate connection, and it does. Personas of poetry can also do these things listed below. They can share real-life experience, which is pretty common. Poetry is often a therapeutic response. People can write fiction as therapy, and poetry is definitely a therapeutic process. They can do a guarded or edited version of a subject. Rachel McKibbins, when I taught this class face-to-face, I would bring in her books of poetry that I have. Rachel McKibbins is a really good poet. She's very modern. And she's had a really traumatic past. Like, her upbringing is extremely disturbing. And she writes a lot about her past experiences, but you can tell that she's edited those poems to where it's not really the whole truthful version. There's a little bit, maybe she's exaggerating, or maybe she's holding back in her poetry. And that's kind of that guarded version that makes you want to read more. You want to learn more about her when you read those poems. So if you get a chance to look up Rachel McKibbins, her stuff's extremely dark and disturbing in terms of the content matter, because she's had a traumatic past. But I think if people have had a similar background, they can really connect with her work, because she's talking about things that we normally don't think about in terms of being in poetry. Poets can adopt the stance of a detached observer, meaning that they just observe things objectively. We talked in fiction about the third-person objective narrator, where it's kind of like Morgan Freeman narrating March of the Penguins. That's poetry stance. Sometimes poets write as like a fly on the wall, and we only see what's happening in the area or the moment of that poem, but we're not involved in that action. And that's a detached observer. And they could be an imaginary character very different from the poet. Dr. Seuss, for example. Dr. Seuss is a household name. We know him as a poet writing children's poetry. He came from a very serious background and is an extremely intellectual writer who has all this background in schooling and education and history behind him. But he created an imaginary persona for himself. He was Dr. Seuss, this very cartoony, childlike figure, kind of like Mr. Rogers, which wasn't really a representation of who he actually was in real life, but was a character he created to kind of reach out to his audience, which is a pretty good strategy. It worked pretty good for Dr. Seuss. But yeah, that's just another example of persona. So anytime you read a poem, you do have to kind of think in the back of your head, is this actually the poet writing the poem as it is, or are they adopting a character or a persona as they write? And that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind if you're analyzing a poem or if you're writing one. So yeah, that's chapter 19. Chapter 20 talks about tone, and that is the language of emotions in poetry. It's the attitude. When somebody's like, watch your tone, you're like, it's the attitude that you do when you create words. And there's a fair amount of poets that use tone to kind of create an emotion or a feeling as you read. The term understatement, we talked about this in fiction as well with Kurt Vonnegut in the Slaughterhouse-Five. Poets downplaying personal feelings to create a stronger impact. And I think Dylan Thomas does an excellent job of this in his poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, on page 880. Every line that he crafts in that poem has so much weight and so much power to it, but it's written in a very simplistic manner. It's written almost like a casual poem, and then the more you read it and analyze it, the more you realize, oh wow, this is talking about some deep, heavy things about going forward in life and not, just accepting fate and actually striving to pursue and fight for survival and for your perseverance. It's a lot more impactful than it looks on the surface, and that's how understatement works in poetry. Elegies are poems of mourning, so it's kind of like if you see an obituary, an elegy is sort of like a obituary in poem form. And a lot of poets back in the 1800s, 1700s wrote a lot of elegies as reflection, as ways of celebrating or giving tribute to someone. But they are poems of mourning. They're about sadness, about loss, things like that. A parable is a brief story with a weighty meaning. Our book is obsessed with the story of Icarus. There are so many examples of this in this chapter and throughout the textbook. Icarus obviously is a story, the Greek mythology, the story about this boy whose father builds him a set of wings made out of wax, and he tells his son, don't fly too close to the sun, otherwise your wings will melt. But Icarus, having all of this power now that he can fly with these wings, ignores his dad's advice and says, no, I'm good. I can fly as high as I want and I'll be fine. And he's really arrogant. And he flies too close to the sun, his wings melt, and he falls into the ocean and drowns. Real good, feel-good stories these Greeks were giving us, right? But the story of Icarus has been constantly retold over and over again because it is a story about pride, and pride being the downfall, that you can't be too arrogant. You need to take other people's advice. You need to be smart about things. And if you let your pride or your arrogance make you feel like you're invincible, you're not, and you're eventually going to succumb to the downfall of that. And this chapter 20 has several different instances where people write poems about Icarus and reimagine him in different contexts. I think probably the most up-to-date or modern example of Icarus would be the film Birdman that came out a few years ago. Had Michael Keaton in it. It was basically like a modern retelling of Icarus, where we have this action movie star that's trying to reinvent himself as this intellectual and artsy person, and he kind of gets arrogant about it, and it backfires stupendously. It's a very interesting movie if you've not seen it. Our book, once again, talks about irony and gives yet another definition of it. This definition of irony for poetry is a wry, humorous effect, bringing out the truth we prefer to hide. I'm not sure if I agree with this. I think the last time we defined irony as things expected to happen and then the opposite occurring for various reasons, I like that definition more than this one. But in terms of poetry, we expect something to be revealed, and what we don't expect to be revealed happens instead. And sometimes irony can be humorous, which is what this chapter is talking about, when irony has kind of a humorous effect. And then we have paradox, which is a contradiction that makes sense on the second thought. And I'm not crazy about that definition from our book either, but a paradox is like a contradiction constantly happening. Like, you can't do this one thing without this happening, but this thing happening will prevent this thing from happening. So have you ever seen the picture of there are stairs, and the stairs kind of just lead into each other, and it's just like a never-ending loop? Look up paradox and stairs on Google, and that's kind of the idea behind it. Again, with irony and paradox, these two definitions, you really won't have to do much with them in terms of this unit on poetry, only if you're going to be analyzing a poem and you notice that it has irony or paradox in it. Then you can use these terms to help analyze your your examples for your paper 2. But otherwise, don't worry too much about these two. They're just kind of, I included them because our chapter highlights them, but I don't believe they'll be on your exam. Chapter 21, Theme, the Making of Meaning. This is where poems get a little bit fun and a little bit frustrating for people, because a lot of poets intentionally leave their themes extremely vague, because their idea is they want everyone to get a different interpretation out of it. And that's admirable. That's fine. It frustrates a lot of people, though, because when we read a fictional story or a nonfiction story, any type of prose, or when we watch a play, those two genres have a very set theme. And by the end of the story, because it's a narrative, by the end of it, we expect to know what that theme is. Which makes sense, right? You read this whole story, you want to know what the purpose of it was. And the author's job is to give that purpose some weight. Maybe make it subtle, maybe make it a little bit vague, but it's at least there. With poetry, oftentimes the poet can make the poem extremely subjective and extremely vague to the point where every person is intentionally supposed to get a different meaning out of it. Which is cool, but a lot of people get frustrated because they're like, no, I just read this poem, I want to know what the meaning of it was. And the poet might be like, you make of it what you want. And that bothers some people. So some things to kind of note with poetry and theme, things to avoid technically. If you're writing a poem, first of all, try to avoid abstractions, which are large areas of human experience that are extremely general. And some poets will do this. They're very abstract. They're like, it's about happiness. Okay. People are happy with different things. So that's kind of abstract. It's like, okay, well, how is it happy to me? It's not. And people get confused by that. So try to avoid being too abstract in your poem. Didactic is teaching an already accepted idea or truth. So sometimes the exact opposite of abstractions happen, where the poet is trying to really just hammer down this theme over and over again. And you're like, okay, I get it. I love Shel Silverstein, but even some of his poems, like the meaning, I'm like, okay, got it. And I would argue Dr. Seuss is guilty of that too. In the Lorax, I love the Lorax deeply, but by the end of it, you're like, okay, I get it. Shouldn't destroy all the trees and drive the animals out with our corporations. Got it. We're solid. We're set. So his poetry can sometimes be didactic. And then a caricature, which is a comic distortion or exaggeration. And a lot of poets use caricature to kind of paint, to try to be a little bit more simplistic and paint this broad picture. Shel Silverstein does a lot of caricatures in his poetry. A lot. And it doesn't help the fact that there are actual drawings in his poetry books. So the drawings are caricatures, they're exaggerated and distorted, and they kind of match up with the poems that he creates. So if you've not ever read Shel Silverstein, go look up Shel Silverstein, and you'll see a picture right next to his poem, and oftentimes those are caricatures of ideas or characters that he's creating for his work. But yeah, that's pretty much theme. And then these last two slides are about myth and illusion. So we will talk about myth and illusion more in drama, because when we get to plays, there is a lot of history behind drama, and a lot of it leads back to Greek and Roman times. So for poetry, our last chapter, chapter 22, kind of hints at the things we're going to talk about in drama, which are myth and illusion. Not illusion, illusion. So in terms of myth, myth comes from the word mythos, which is Greek for tales. So mythos means tales in Greek. And they are stories, most of your myths or poetries that use myth from Greek times involved gods, godlike heroes, or monstrous adversaries. They were very, very narrative based. Very much like, kind of like Beowulf is. Beowulf is a poem, and it is very myth-like. There's monsters, and Beowulf's kind of this Herculean godlike figure. So there's a little bit of parallel there. A lot of mythic poems from Greek times involved rituals, which were events acted out among heroes or celebrated champions or redeemers. So Beowulf, for example, and I know Beowulf isn't a Greek poem, but I'm going to use it because it's a good example. In Beowulf, he has to go through this trial. He has to go to Grendel's cave to go fight the monster. And that's a very ritualistic act. The idea, we even see it in modern poetry and modern fiction, the idea that the hero has to go to this castle or cave to fight the monster. That's a very ritualistic attribute that we see in poems and in fiction. Archetypes, we talked about this in prose. They are constant types of characters in stories that are sometimes generalized and sometimes stereotyped. So we've talked about the hero, the damsel in distress, the monstrous villain. Those occur in poetry just like they do fiction. And we'll see them pop up again when we do drama in weeks 11 and 12. Allusion. Not illusion. Allusion is a brief mention that calls up a story and leads to a flashback. So an illusion with an I is like a kind of like a mirage, something that's not really there. Allusion, it leads to a flashback. So if you hear somebody say, oh, well, this alludes to something, that means it's calling back or making reference to. That's what an allusion is. It's a reference that usually leads to a flashback. So we'll see this pop up in drama a lot because in drama, we have to have something that leads to the flashback. We can't just start out with a flashback on stage. People will be like, what's going on? So a character might mention something that leads to a flashback, and that's an allusion. An ode is an elaborate set of stanzas that deal with solemn subjects. So it's not quite an elegy, it's not quite about mourning, but maybe it's something about something serious. Like when you hear somebody say an ode to this or an ode to that. It's a serious poem that is paying tribute to something or talking about it, but maybe not in a sad way. It could be an ode to joy. For example, the song Ode to Joy is a very serious song, but it's not sad. It's just a serious song about the subject matter. And then metamorphosis. I feel like we've heard this term from learning about butterflies and caterpillars in grade school science. Metamorphosis is a transformation. And I would ask you to look at the glossy pages that start from page 954. The next set of glossy pages I like even more than the last set. So I would recommend, I think I talked about them last week. I would definitely check out those. And then, like I talked to you all about in terms of different things, we have the Tale of Icarus, and there are several poems that deal with Icarus sprinkled throughout this chapter. All right. And that's pretty much our discussion of poetry. I can't believe we're already done. I hope you all have enjoyed poetry. I know that our paper is due at the end of this week. I enjoy teaching poetry a lot. And I hope that even though you may not like poetry, and some people still by the end of this section are like, ugh, I don't like poetry. I hope at least you have an appreciation of it. And I really am excited for the discussion forum we do this week. I think that kind of solidifies it when you get to read other people's poems spoken by them out loud, and you get to see the passion they put into it. I really think that's usually an awesome assignment that we get to do. So if you have any questions about this week or before spring break, please let me know. Please send me an email if you have any questions about anything. Otherwise, I will probably be off my computer for most of spring break, but I will check it when we get back online after the upgrade. So if you need to send me an email, go ahead and do it, and I will get your things graded. I promise it might just take me a little longer than usual. But if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great week 9 and enjoy your spring break. Really enjoy it, all right? And I will talk to you all about drama when we come back.